Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Daniela Martinez, and I am the recent alumni and student program coordinator at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. Welcome to our first quarterly Leeds Professional Development webinar of 2023. We are so excited to be here today. Leeds is a top business school offering undergraduate, MBA, executive MBA, MS, and PhD programs, and has an alumni network of over 41,000 strong living and working around the world. For today's Leeds Professional Development webinar, we're excited to welcome Richard Wobbekind and Brian Lewandowski, who are here presenting a Colorado Business Economic Outlook. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Rich and Brian, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Rich and Brian will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speakers. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link access to the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants on Friday, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentations. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Richard Wobbekind, an Associate Dean for Business and Government Relations and Senior Economist and Faculty Director of the Business Research Division at the University of Colorado Boulder. He joined the faculty at the Leeds School of Business in 1985 and has served as an Associate Dean since 2000. As Faculty Director of the Business Research Division, his responsibilities include developing an annual consensus forecast of the Colorado economy and performing various economic impact assessments of the Colorado economy. Wobbekind also produces the quarterly Leeds Business Confidence Index for Colorado. Brian Lewandowski is the Executive Director of the Business Research Division at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado Boulder. Brian provides regional business and economic information and education, including economic and revenue forecasts, policy studies, economic impact analyses, and data workshops. Brian has 15 years experience conducting economic studies at CU Boulder. Welcome, Rich and Brian, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand over the webinar controls to you now.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and welcome to the folks that are online. It's a snowy day in Boulder. We're in a storm, and much of the Colorado, the Denver metro area. So if you're in the Denver metro area, I hope you're warm and bundled up somewhere. And if you're not, I hope you're enjoying the day in a beautiful day wherever you are. So this is a follow-up to our release of our annual forecast that we did at the beginning of December. And as you will see when we go through these slides, many of them are updated from a month and a half ago or a month ago. So you'll get the most updated data and discussion of, as is always the case when we do our presentations. But you get a real sense of what our committee members thought in terms of our employment forecasts and sort of the overall state of the economy. And we're divvying up the workload today. Brian and I'm going up on the front end and talking about the macro economy and handing it off as we go into the state economy for Brian to pick it up and talk about a lot of the findings from, again, our 58th annual Business Economic Outlook. And I would also call your attention to the fact that the actual booklet is online in PDF format. So if you'd like more details about what we released back in December, it's easily accessible. So with that, let me start by talking about on top of everyone's mind is sort of the concept of, are we going into a recession? And we had, of course, to forecast some sort of a backdrop for our state forecast. We needed to talk about what the national forecast was going to be, the driver, if you will, of economic activity at the state level. So you can see that we've had some pretty serious recessions over time. But the most recent one, the COVID recession, was the shortest on record. It was very short. And we have seen, GDP recover at a very rapid rate. I'll talk more about that in sort of just a moment. So when we look at this picture, I'll spend a little bit more time on this slide and less on some of the others. But when we look at this picture, it's the uncertainty out there about whether or not we're going into a recession. We had very strong GDP in the third quarter, and we don't have the fourth quarter numbers yet, but they will also be quite strong. So back, if you recall, in the first and second quarter, people said, oh, we have negative GDP growth, we're in a recession. Of course, the definition of a recession is much broader than negative GDP growth. And many of the things you see on this particular slide are elements of what is used to date a recession. So that's why we're sort of, following these different indicators. And certainly not only GDP, but employment and income continue to rise, and they're key elements of a recessionary scenario. But we do see a lot of troubling signs out there. Some of these will appear in slides here in the next few minutes. The ISM is slipping. That's the confidence index for business. Consumer confidence has bounced a little bit. That's kind of a good thing. But we've seen a little bit of an issue with consumption wavering, in particular, the data even up through this morning. Prices have been getting better, but there's still inflation is still pretty high by historical context. So that's getting better. It's kind of in the yellow. Interest rates are most likely going to move a little bit higher over the course of this year, or at least the first 6 months. We're seeing a lot of debt increase. Industrial production has been an issue, and also capacity utilization, other key elements of industry. And we are seeing labor force sort of growth kind of leveling. So that's kind of a neutral. So you can see there's a few really positive things there, but there's a lot of reasons why you'd have some cause for concern in the overall picture. And so when we do our forecast, this forecast, but also the forecast we do for a number of municipalities, when we do these forecasts, we have scenarios, if you will, a high and a low sort of forecast scenario. And in our particular case, you can see the red dotted line is sort of the forecast, but then you have the tan line and at the top and the blue line at the bottom is sort of high and low sort of scenario. And I draw your attention to this in particular, because that red dotted line, if you were to look at that carefully, it's not going down. So this is not describing an economy going into a recession. It's describing a really slow economy, very slow GDP growth, 0.5% to maybe 1%. And whether or not technically we have a recession, it's just going to feel like a really, really slow growth time. But as you can also see, if the blue scenario comes into play, we wind up having a recession sort of in the middle to second half of the year. So it's possible, yes. We think even if it happens, it would be very mild. But mostly we're thinking it's going to be a very slow period for economic growth. Why slow? Well, the last couple of years, the consumer has been sort of the hero of GDP growth. And as many of you know, consumption is roughly 70% of GDP. So if the consumer continues to grow year in, year out in terms of their expenditures, that helps GDP to grow on a quarterly and an annualized basis. The consumer is pretty much tapped out at this point. So we think there's going to be very slow consumption growth. And I'm going to show you some data to sort of support that as we go forward, but very slow consumption growth. Even on the right-hand side, government spending, even with the infrastructure spending, government spending remains weak in all of the forecasts for the year ahead. Of significant concern is the amount of investment in the economy. We think that will be really weak this year and actually into next year as well at this point. There's just a lot of concern about the growth of the economy. There's a lot of concern about the higher interest rates in the economy and so on. And there's nothing to say or give us any indication that the export picture is going to be able to carry the economy. So really weakness everywhere, significant weakness in investment and government spending, but also significant slowdown in consumption, which is the big driver of a much weaker economy. So let's talk about jobs first. Yes, we are back. It may seem like an illusion looking at this slide, but the black dot at the end is roughly 1.2 million jobs higher than we were at our peak in February of 2020. So we are at a higher point in terms of total number of jobs. We've regained all the jobs that were lost, and you can see that was a lot of jobs that were lost. But that said, if you were to trend this out, which is the red line, and say if this COVID recession never happened, where would we be? We would be at a higher number. We would be, 2.5 million jobs higher than we are right now. So yes, it's great that we got the jobs back, but that said, the jobs back really, the jobs lost would, really set us back and took us off of our employment trend line. All of this in the context of very strong issues related to labor shortages. We have, most importantly, you continue to hear about the job openings and labor turnover survey, which comes out monthly. That's illustrated on the left side. And right now, nationally, in the most recent data, even though that red line is coming down, meaning the job openings are slowing in the economy, we still, at this point in time, have 1.8 jobs available for every unemployed person. So this has gotten way out of balance. We have way more job openings than we have people to fill those job openings. And that continues to be an issue, even with the announcements of hearing, high-tech layoffs and the different things that you're hearing and reading about among some of the tech giants. All of this driving an unemployment rate, which is now at 3.5% nationally, lower than it was going into the COVID recession. So very tight labor markets, still very good prospects in terms of employment, even though we're sitting here talking about what is the potential for a recession in the economy. One of the reasons that we focus on employment is that, of course, employment's an important driver of income. When you look at these sort of four pieces of income, we call national personal income when it's all aggregated together, the biggest one, and you can see the scale, the upper left-hand quadrant, is employee compensation, wages and salaries, if you will. So you can see that that has come back nicely, is continuing to grow. It's very strong. You can also see dividends, interest, and rents, another component of income, have continued to grow and look very strong. Again, these data all through November, the most recent data that we have. Proprietor income, also at very good levels, bottom left-hand quadrant in red. So you get really good numbers here when you look across the various dimensions. And then on the bottom right, you get something that I tend to go off on a little bit, the transfer payments. So I would highlight just a couple of things. One, if you took the three highest sort of green bars, those translate specifically into when the checks came out. The April check in 2020, the January check in 2021, and the big, really high bar was the President Biden's stimulus that came out in March of 2021. So you can see the effects of those. You can also see the effects of additional unemployment benefits from the state from the federal government on top of the state unemployment benefits. You can also see the child care credits that were given out and these transfer receipts. But now that we're back down to sort of where we are, it is interesting that the transfers are still at a higher level now at 3.5% unemployment than they were, excuse me, going into this recession. If you go back to February 2020, there were fewer transfers in February 2020 than there are now. And somewhat significantly percentage-wise, if you look at the N bars on both ends here. So this is a little perplexing, why these transfer receipts remain a little bit higher, even though the economy is in such a strong position. So looking at that same data in a little bit slightly different way, and we look at personal income and savings, and you can see on the top line is personal income, and you can see those spikes up relating to when the transfer checks went out, the three sort of really strong spikes up. You can see in the second line, consumption dropping significantly when we had the COVID, March, when we had the shutdown of the economy. But it may not be easy to see, but that red line is now trending up at a more rapid rate, meaning consumption has gone up even more rapidly in the economy as we go through this. And the one that I just like to bring to everybody's attention is the bottom line. So that's the savings rate in the economy. And you can see on this graphic, we go back to 2006. But if you were to look at the series all the way back to 1959 when it started, the last 3 months are 3 of the 4 lowest personal savings rates in history. So we did have low personal savings rates back in the 2008 recession. You can sort of see that, but we are down at very, very slow, very, very low savings rates. So the consumer is running out of savings, is using their income to consume, not to save right now. They still have good employment and they're getting good income, but whether it's due to the inflationary pressures or whatever, the consumer is being impacted in terms of their ability to save. We also know that a lot of this transfer payments, particularly the checks, went to savings accounts, especially in the upper half of the income bracket. So you can see as we pre-COVID in Q1 2020, the amount of excess savings that was in the economy all the way in that little left-hand bar. And then you can see how much excess savings accrued in the economy, up over 2 trillion when we got up into 2021, after we got the checks in March of 2021, and now that is getting burned down. So, but it still exists. So that will be some support for consumption in the economy, particularly amongst in the top income category and in the second quartile, the 50 to 75% group. You can sort of see the people down there in tan and red are bottom quartile have substantially less of this excess savings at this point. So another topic that gets a lot of airplay, if you will, is inflation, and it certainly should. It was at levels not seen since the 1980s. And so we have late 70s and early 80s. So we have seen sort of a dramatic increase in inflation that really has taken a lot of people by surprise. It tends to affect confidence. And because so many people were experiencing this inflation for the first time in their lives, people who are, younger than I am hadn't really seen this before. So now we see, we see the effects that has had. And looking specifically at this inflation slide, I need to point out that the U.S. city average, 6.5%, and the mountain region, which is the mountain states, at 7.4%, are both December numbers that just came out last week. We saw, again, a nice decline in percentage increase in inflation year over year. The Denver, Aurora, Lakewood one, which reflects Colorado, only comes out every other month, so that's a November number. And in November, when they were all November, Denver, Aurora, Lakewood had a lower rate. So I would anticipate next time we see Denver, Aurora, Lakewood in the January numbers, we will see it much more in line with the U.S. city average, or even potentially below the U.S. city average when we get the when we get those numbers in. But you can see it is a much better number than 8-9%. And if you go down to the bottom and look at the core, you can see in the US, the core is down to 5.7%, all by way of saying, a long way of saying, it seems like the Fed is winning this battle. It's causing all sorts of concern in terms of some people saying the Fed should back off on the interest rate increases, other Fed members saying this battle isn't won yet. It's where we're sort of stabilizing the situation, but we haven't, it's not over yet. The inflation battle isn't over yet. So there's a lot of discussion in and around that topic. And as I mentioned, we're believing that the consumer is sort of running out of gas, and you can see this reflected on the right-hand side here. Not so much the mortgage debt, which is the black, because a lot of that was, of course, financed at very attractive rates and was really in the home buying spree. But if you look at those tan bars, you can see a real surge in terms of consumer credit, automobile loans, credit cards, and so on. So this is, again, something we're paying a lot of attention to. Are people getting into deeper and deeper levels of debt in order to sort of leverage where they are? And of course, this slide just sort of tells the story. When I look at this, sometimes people look at this and say, oh, we thought it would be worse than that. I mean, worse than 1.375 trillion in debt in a year. I mean, look at that back historically. I mean, we're in a growth economy, and we're running up really, really high levels of debt this year, even with a growing economy and very low unemployment. So it's troubling. And of course, the overall accumulated debt is at a pretty high level, and we're going to be, and we are, refinancing that at higher and higher interest rates as the treasuries have moved up over the last 9 months or so. So confidence and paying attention to the time and moving this along. Confidence, again, consumer confidence and consumer sentiment. Sentiment on the right-hand side took a much steeper plunge. It got back to levels not seen since early days of the it hit some of the lowest levels it's ever hit in the series. And again, the one on the right-hand side, consumer sentiment, has a heavier weight and different questions that relate to inflation versus employment. The consumer confidence survey on the left gives a little bit more traction to the employment picture. And of course, the employment picture remains positive. We look at business confidence. We look at these ISM surveys. You can see on the manufacturing side, it's negative, but even on the services side on the right, it went down below 50. Below 50 is contractionary when you look at that picture. And then if that's not enough sort of bad news, you look at the small business outlook from the National Federation of Independent Business, and you can see that has been well below the 0 line on the left-hand one or the 100 line on the right-hand one. Both of those have been sort of very pessimistic in terms of Main Street sort of businesses and how they feel about the economy. So certainly business confidence is not looking good as a cornerstone as we begin 2023. And our own Leeds Business Confidence Index also came out last week with a very low rating, down around 40, just under 40. And this is two of the components. And as you can see, the business confidence index is higher for Colorado, but still both of these are pretty low levels, expected to go up by the survey panelists, expecting to get better in Q2, but Q1 to be pretty pessimistic. So if you scan this QR code, we're putting this into presentations, you can register and receive free access to the Colorado Business Economic Outlook, the Colorado Business Review, the Leeds Business Confidence Index, our quarterly indicators report, and research publications. But mostly, I want to say, you can specifically sign up and participate in the Leeds Business Confidence Index, which we would really like people to do, business people to do. So the only caveat on that is if you're watching this from some other part of the country, we really want Colorado business people to be participating in this, not people from California, Seattle, and so on who are signed up for this particular webinar. Moving on and closing out, Fed and interest rates. We have the Fed situation going on. They're doing quantitative tightening, meaning they're burning down their balance sheet. This is putting upward pressure on longer term rates. We also know that they have been raising shorter term rates, the federal funds rate. We know the Federal Reserve does the federal funds rate, but we also know that the prime rate is set in Boulder, Colorado. When you look at this particular, that's a joke, but I can't hear you laughing, but I hope you're laughing. And then you can see here, and we hear this pretty consistently, when people are seeing interest rates up, mortgage rates up over 6%, that has really put a crimp in the housing market, has really slowed housing down. And one last indicator here, for those of you who are familiar with the yield curve, it's one indicator of recession, a potential indicator of recession. You can see how it's tracked against recessions over time. If you go back here, you can also see on the right-hand side, it has persisted, in an inverted yield curve for a period of time now. And so some of the people who are very strong advocates of the yield curve are suggesting that this is probably the best indicator that we're going to see recession 6 months from now, or not 9 months from now, that the yield curve can't remain inverted for that long without some sort of recessionary output. So we're moving on to Colorado at this point, and in particular, I'm going to be passing the baton to my colleague, Brian. But here, I just want to start off by showing you the Colorado rank in all of these different categories, and drawing your attention to two in particular, the fourth and fifth line, which I have been referring to as wow numbers. Our personal income growth, second highest in the country, and our per capita income growth, first highest in the country. So to speak more about this and to tell you more about the Colorado forecast, here's my colleague, Brian.
And I'll take it away. So Rich was just describing Colorado as an outperformer. Over the next few minutes, I will provide more evidence of how Colorado is outperforming the country. And we think Colorado will remain an outperformer in the near term, but there's also some real challenges that we'll talk through a little bit as well. So in terms of GDP growth, Rich showed what's happening with the national GDP growth. Strong third quarter nationally. We expect fourth quarter is going to come in pretty strong as well. And then this expected slowdown will ensue. When we're looking at the states, Colorado is outperforming the nation, and it's actually outperforming most other states. So we ranked ranked sixth in the third quarter, coming in at 3.2%. So we're sixth year over year, but when it comes to quarter over quarter, we came in a little bit slower. We were ranked 16th. We're ranked a little bit behind states like Idaho and Tennessee and Texas and Florida and Oregon, but still clearly outperforming the country when it comes to real GDP growth. So thinking about what's building up to that GDP growth, we can actually take a look at GDP growth by industry at the state level. And I think what's notable for Colorado is we see the strongest growth coming from two industries, professional and business services, and the information sector. So collectively, those two sectors accounted for about half of the growth that we saw in Colorado's GDP year over year. And those are really representing our high-tech industries, right? So think about research and development, think about engineering and software development, think about some of our key industry clusters in the state, like aerospace, biosciences, clean tech. And these tend to be advanced technology industries, high-paying jobs requiring a lot of sort of skills and education behind those occupations. And this is an area where Colorado's been thriving. But when we take a look at the sectors that are detracting from growth, It's mostly our goods producing sectors. So agriculture, manufacturing, construction, all of those are declining. And they declined year over year to the sum of about $5.5 billion collectively. So all of our services sectors grew while all of our goods producing sectors decreased. When we think about a sector like agriculture, if you take a look at our forecast book that we published in December, you'll see that we estimated record farm revenue in 2022, but we also estimated record farm expenses in 2022. So put those two together, and what we saw was a estimated decrease in net farm income. So I think that sort of illustrates the difficulty when it comes to our goods producing sectors right now. There's so much price volatility, both in terms of the revenue, but there's also so much price volatility when it comes to the inputs to production. And there's also these headwinds that Rich was describing when it comes to trade and the value of the dollar, global supply chain disruptions. And so that's where we see a lot of volatility in some of our current projections. So Colorado, as Rich showed on that ranking slide, Colorado is outperforming the country a little bit when it comes to population growth. We ranked 17th last year when it came to population growth. But we're in a slightly different position than we have been over the last couple of decades, where we recorded the slowest population growth since 1990, the slowest net migration number since 1990, and the slowest natural increase number since at least 1970. That's as far as back as that data currently goes from the Colorado Demography Office. And so when we think about the net migration piece, those are really representing workers today. So we think about this in terms of people who move to Colorado, who can be a source of labor for Colorado companies. So people move here, net migration, jobs today, that natural increase piece, we're really taking a look at the births side. And that's really the investment in our future workforce. And so both of those really hit low numbers in 2021. We actually expect the natural increase to have bounced in 2022 and will start to increase again. Net migration, we think, is on the rebound right now, but that slower population piece is troubling for a few reasons, especially when we take a look at shifting demographics, which is sort of a pervasive problem across the country. We're missing a lot of the youth that we've had. And think about what that means for not only the future workers, but what it means today for the K-12 system. We've seen this around Colorado in our largest school districts, grappling with decreasing enrollments and decisions to close schools. So there's a lot of issues that come from slower population growth. In terms of employment, Colorado has been a leading state. Year over year, we're still recording 3.7% growth. We're 15th best in the country. When it comes to the recovery from the pandemic recession, we rank 11th best. We have 2.9% growth. But I think what's notable looking at this map of the US is all of the orange and red that's still up here. So there are 26 states that have reached or surpassed their pre-pandemic employment levels. Only half the country. And I think, for Colorado, we've been here for about a year where we've been above our pre-pandemic level. That it feels like history now, but there's a lot of the country that is that's still below that peak. They're still trying to regain those jobs that were lost during the pandemic. So this is our forecast from December. We're projecting an estimated 121,000 jobs added in Colorado in 2022. Just so you know, that's the most jobs we've ever added in this state. It's the first year that we added more than 100,000 jobs. So we're bouncing from 2020, where we lost the most jobs ever, to 2021, which 2021 was also a record year in terms of job growth. 2022, we surpassed 100,000. And then 2023, we're projecting a slowdown. And I think as we've debated this internally, we keep coming back to a supply of worker issue. So that we think that's a real headwind. Colorado has the second highest labor force participation rate in the country. It's about where we were right before the pandemic recession happened, even a little bit above that. We know that Colorado is getting older as a state. We have fewer youth here. So we see this as a headwind because we don't have enough workers. But we also see sort of a rebalancing of the supply and demand for workers, less demand from Colorado companies. And on the supply side, we see a little bit more supply coming in, especially as people make that decision to go back and get that second job. We saw a lot of these multi-job holders go away during the pandemic, and there's still a little bit of headroom there to get some more workers back. So with the spread of this job growth across the economy, we see almost every industry adding jobs in 2023, with the exception of construction and financial activities. And so, you can relate this to the interest rate increases, where construction and financial activities are two industries that are really at the front of the exposure of rising interest rates. On the high side of the job growth, again, professional and business services. So those high-tech industries, high-skilled industries, it's clearly on the services side of our economy, in R&D and engineering and software development. Leisure and hospitality is an industry that we think will return to peak levels of employment in 2023. When we take a look at the annual average, it'll be the highest number of people employed in that industry in our state ever. And then when we take a look at professional and business services and trade, transportation, and utilities, 2023 will be a year where both of those will have more than 500,000 workers each in the state of Colorado. So there are these huge super sectors employing a lot of people in the state. When we take a look at this geographically around Colorado, looking at the November employment numbers, we're still seeing the fastest growth in the northern Front Range area. So Boulder and Denver are both in the top 100 metropolitan areas nationally when it comes to job growth. Fort Collins isn't too far behind. But remember that there's about 72% of Colorado's employment is in the North Front Range metropolitan area, ranging from Greeley and Fort Collins down to Boulder and Denver. And that's pretty proportional when it comes to job growth over the past year. It represents about 70%, 73% of our jobs added over the last year. And then wages, right? So we've seen a lot of pressure on the expenditure side of the household ledger when it comes to inflation, high energy prices. And what we saw was sort of this lag until wages started to really show strong year-over-year increases. So now we're looking at an average of over 8% wage growth year over year, which actually beat out inflation over the past couple of months. Okay, so I'm going to delve into just a couple of industries before I wrap it up. And I'll start with construction and real estate in Colorado. So, Rich talked about inflation quite a bit at the beginning. Colorado is a state that's had higher inflation numbers than the nation overall for 10 of the last 11 years. And the year-end numbers came in for 2022, and Colorado was at 8%. The nation was at 8%, so you can call it a tie. But now what we're seeing is two really important components of inflation, energy costs and housing. Colorado is sort of leading the nation down when it comes to a couple of these metrics. So on the housing side, looking at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the purchase only index for Colorado came in under 10% year over year in the third quarter. And so that's a lower rate than the average state. It's also a lower rate than Colorado's seen in years. And the purchase only index is lower than the all transactions index, which is still in the double digits. But the purchase only index is interesting for us to watch because it represents a transaction where there's a real buyer and a seller, where the all transactions index can include the refinancing of a home. When we take a look at the metropolitan areas in the state, we look at the all transactions index because we can take a look at all of Colorado's 7 MSAs. And you can see where this is sort of a territory that we haven't been in a while, where most of Colorado's MSAs are below average when it comes to home price growth year over year. So there's been so much talk about affordability or lack of affordability when it comes to housing. And even though we're leading the state down, the rate of appreciation doesn't fix an affordability issue that we have when it comes to housing. If we're talking about 9.6% growth, that's still appreciating way faster than most income or wealth is in the state. Building permits, we estimated that 2022 building permits will be down a little bit, and we expect that to decrease a little bit further in 2023 as we see demand wane a little bit in a higher interest rate environment. And most housing that we see being built right now is in the north metropolitan areas in Colorado, from Denver up to Greeley. And then this really transfers to the overall value of construction in the state. So we're projecting a decrease in the residential value of construction as we see fewer homes built. But we also see non-residential construction pulling back a little bit. It's just a little bit under flat for 2023. And then non-building construction or infrastructure building, roads and bridges and such, we think there could be a slight increase in 2023 when it comes to infrastructure building. Natural resources and mining, I talked about this a little bit on the GDP slide, but I think the difficulty with natural resources and mining estimates is the price volatility that we're seeing right now. So we're actually a top 10 state when it comes to energy production generally. So top 7 when it comes to petroleum, and 9th when it comes to wet natural gas reserves, 4th in crude oil produced. So when I first moved here, I didn't really think of Colorado as a heavy energy producing state, but we're really a leader when it comes to energy production. So what do we need to be mindful of when it comes to energy production and total energy output? It is this price volatility. So I pulled up here overall prices over the past year, and you can see the curve on your screen, and where we've ended up in very early 2023, the first week of 2023, in terms of prices, is actually about where we started a year ago. So I think we're still above break even when it comes to producing, say, oil in the state. But the decrease in natural gas prices may hurt new production on the western slope in Colorado, but it may be a real welcome signal to households that are getting some sticker shock when they're paying their monthly natural gas bill. And in terms of total output of oil, we're expecting that to be about flat in 2023, given the dynamics of price and total output of production. So most of this activity continues to be on the eastern side of the state. So east of the mountains, when we think about Greeley as our major oil producer in the state, this is where most of our drilling activity continues to happen in Colorado. And so when we take a look at counties such as Garfield or La Plata, that's where we have more natural gas production in the state. So it's still leaning towards oil, and it's still leaning towards the eastern half of Colorado when it comes to energy production. So real quickly on leisure and hospitality, just a reminder that leisure and hospitality we really mean tourism when we say that industry name. And this was an industry that was really hammered by the pandemic and has climbed back slowly from those pandemic lows. And we do expect employment to get back to peak for the annual totals in 2023. But there's a lot of other good metrics out there when it comes to tourism. And one of those is activity at Denver International Airport. So major airport, we're still we're still third best in the world when it comes to passenger traffic through DIA. And that's in part because it's such a domestic airport. We're less dependent on the international traveler. So our airport was one of the first to rebound. But when we take a look at the 2022 numbers year to date through November, I think it's really notable that it's the highest ever when we're taking a look at the first 11 months of the year. December should be out soon, but we're back. We're back to peak levels when it comes to the number of people that we're servicing through DIA. Retail sales, we usually throw into the tourism sector because this is where some of our retail is picked up, especially when we think about the restaurants and bars part of retail. But we also think about it in tourism because so many visitors come to Colorado and they spend their dollars on retail purchases. And I pull this up here because we're looking at a national retail slide or a national retail line and a Colorado retail line. And you can see how highly correlated these two series are. So we're not decoupled from the nation when it comes to retail. And Rich mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that consumption is one of those worries that we have. We see that the consumer is getting strained a little bit right now. They're spending down their savings. They're not allocating as much to savings. They're taking on more debt. And that showed up in the retail sales report that was just released this morning. So still up 6% year over year in nominal terms. When we adjust that for inflation, it's perhaps a little bit negative. But when we take a look at the month over month number for national retail sales, national retail ended up shrinking by 1.1%. And so we were thinking about this, looking at all of the sectors of retail, and it was almost across the board where we saw a decline in national retail from November to December. So it wasn't isolated to just say gasoline stations that saw a decrease in prices. It was electronics stores and sporting goods stores. I mean, it was really a broad-based decline from November to December. And so then we were thinking about it, wondering if, well, perhaps people shifted their purchases back from December to November, just thinking about supply chain shortages and worrying about making their holiday purchases and getting what they wanted and needed. But November was also a decrease month over month. So that's a troubling pattern. It's only 2 data points, but that's something we're keeping our eye on in terms of consumption. So very lastly, I'll end with Colorado taxable sales by jurisdiction. And we like to take a look at the 30 largest taxing jurisdictions in the state and how their taxable retail sales have been performing compared to 2019, the last sort of normal year, and then also compared to last year. And comparing 2022 through October to 2019 through October, it's just phenomenal growth. Places like Castle Rock and Commerce City that are up almost 60% compared to 2019. But even on the low end, if you take a look at Lone Tree and Englewood, still up about 10%. So retail is back. It's above peak across these jurisdictions. So after that first spurt of recovery, how have they been performing? So we pulled in the year over year numbers for retail. And what we see is there's still this sustained growth across all of these jurisdictions for the first 10 months of the year. But I think it's sort of interesting taking a look at where the fastest growth is happening. And it's in our tourism hotspots in the state, places like Vail and Steamboat and Aspen are recording the fastest year-over-year growth when it comes to retail sales. So that's one of those current tailwinds that we're going to keep our eye on as consumption starts to perhaps turn a little bit. So tailwinds, headwinds, and unknowns. This is sort of the rubric that we use when thinking about the economy at large. We can certainly think about tailwinds, the things that are still pushing the economy along, but I feel that our headwinds list gets longer and longer as each month passes. And this is why I think there's concerns about a real slowing economy in 2023. And I think so much of that is going to rest on the consumer. And I think that consumption piece is really the piece that could dip us into a light recession this year. I'm going to put this QR code back up here in case anyone missed it the first time and would like to sign up for our publications or to participate in the Leeds Business Confidence Index. Otherwise, we'll turn it back to you for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich and Brian. We're going to start off our Q&A segment with a pre-submitted question. A lot of people are wondering what's going to happen to real estate in 2023. Can you broadly answer how Colorado's housing market is going to compare to the national forecast?
So we addressed that a little bit in the presentation, but especially Brian did just a few minutes ago, but I think the feeling is we're slowing down a little bit faster in terms of price appreciation. And I don't think that should be sort of shocking given how strong our home appreciation has been relative to almost everywhere in the country. Brian was talking about where we are in the FHFA index now, and for many years we were a top 5 every year in terms of fastest appreciating, and certainly the Denver area in particular. So we have it slowing down. We don't have it sort of being in bad shape. And then on the flip side of that, let me just say the studies that have been done both nationally and in Colorado still see pretty severe shortages in terms of the housing stock. Millions of units short nationally, tens of thousands of units short in Colorado. So when this mortgage rate stuff gets straightened out, I think the demand is still definitely there for the housing. It's not like we've built way too much housing. It's just a question of the mortgage rates and affordability right now.
Thank you, Rich. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question right here from our live audience. How do you expect the federal or banks to encourage consumer savings again, given the savings rates are at the lowest levels since 2006? And similarly, should employers be considering saving options to attract employees?
So yes, and I think in Colorado, we actually passed a law that requires businesses to have employees have the ability to have like a savings account that's related to their employment. I do think ideally, I think businesses would be sort of matching those savings accounts, and that would be, really the ideal situation to encourage more savings on the part of employees. But mostly, I think the issue is savings is one thing, rolling up debt is even more critical. So I think there's a real question there of can we make sure that people don't get themselves too much in the hole?
Great. Thank you so much. Another pre-submitted question asks, how will the lack of water in the Colorado River affect our future?
We'll let Brian start with that.
I'll start. So we asked a question in our recent Leeds Business Confidence Index about how water would affect company growth over the next year. And I was sort of surprised at the lack of concern for the short term, right? So most businesses, I think it was 80% of individuals who responded said it's a low concern for the next year. I think it sort of illustrates that it's a longer term concern. It's a longer term problem, and people aren't really taking it that seriously. And it sort of makes it difficult when we get heavy rains in California or heavy snows in Colorado, because I think at a glance, people sort of forget how big of a problem it is. But I think it does pose a real headwind for continued development in the state. We've already seen some jurisdictions in Colorado who had to slow or stop development because they didn't have water rights. And I think that story will just get perpetuated as we go through time. So if it's slowing down urban growth of housing, or if it's constraining our ability to attract new businesses, especially water intensive businesses, I think that is the reality as we look forward.
Thank you, Brian. I think we have time for one last question, which I'll take here from our audience. With rising rates, is there a concern regarding corporate default rates increasing both nationally and in Colorado?
Oh, put me on the spot with that one. Yes, there's a concern, but only amongst a certain tranche, if you will, of business borrowing. Lots of the businesses are extremely well capitalized. So unlike the 2008 recession, when the global financial crisis, we have a lot of equity in the housing market. We have a lot of cash on the balance sheets of business. We have extremely strong balance sheets in the banking sector. So is there a chance of some default? Yes, but it's going to wind up being, if the economy slowed dramatically, then some of the businesses that are, lower rated business debt might be called into question.
Thank you. I think we might actually have time for one more. A pre-submitted question asks, how will a tight employment market affect inflation long-term if we do not have enough people to fill jobs in the midterm?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question, and this is the tightrope the Federal Reserve is trying to walk right now. They're trying to, their concern is not just price inflation, meaning products. They're definitely focused on wage inflation, because ultimately wage inflation turns into more price pressure in the economy. So right now they're paying, those monthly job reports are coming out. They're paying a lot of attention to the number of jobs, but they're paying even, I believe they're paying even more attention to the average wage that's being paid. And we have seen a little bit of dampening in that sort of wage piece. So all of that said, if we're not going to have more people in the workforce, Brian described the population issue for Colorado, but it's and the nation. So we have a population issue. We change immigration, that could potentially help, but I actually think it's going to be mostly met by businesses figuring out how to automate some of their processes. Where possible, I think those are the places we're going to see productivity gains with tighter labor forces.
Thank you, Rich. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's presentation. And thank you again to both Rich and Brian for this great information. At this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll questions. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or fellow Leeds alumni? We thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email on Friday with a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars, as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/business/alumni. We look forward to our next webinar, which will be in the next quarter. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs!